You may be seated. This is the Sunday of Christ the King, the last Sunday in Pentecost. Here we have the culmination or the gathering up of what Christ meant, Christ the King. But what does it mean to be king? We hear it talked about. Jesus was called king. We sing a lot of hymns referring to Christ the King. But what does it mean? There are so many iterations of king throughout history. So let's explore its basic meanings. Try to discern how Jesus viewed the meaning of king and how the church has responded to the meaning of king that he taught and lived. In Jesus' day, there were various kings and, of course, also the emperor. The focus was on power and might. That focus continued to be the dominant motif through the centuries. But there was an alternative approach. In one of the earliest writings in English, the pre-Christian poem Beowulf says, "A good king is one who protects and provides." In fact, after many years as a good king providing for his people, Beowulf loses his life protecting them, although his action saved their lives. A few centuries later, we have the legend of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table. Arthur is focused not on power, but on providing for his people. The Arthurian legend was turned into a musical and subsequently a film. Early in the musical, Arthur expresses this determination to provide a wonderful place for his people in the title song, Camelot. It's true. It's true. The crown has made it clear. The climate must be perfect all the year. A law was made a distant moon ago here. July and August cannot be too hot. And there's a legal limit to the snow here in Camelot. The winter is forbidden till December and exits March the 2nd on the spot. By order, summers linger through September in Camelot. I know it sounds a bit bizarre, but in Camelot, that's how conditions are. The rain may never fall till after sundown. And what about yesterday? By 8, the morning fog must disappear. In short, there's simply not a more congenial spot for happily ever aftering than here in Camelot. Things go very well for a while, but eventually egos and desire for power among some of the knights rise up. One knight steals Arthur's queen. Others gather to try to overthrow Arthur. And the closing scene, as Arthur is so distraught as his kingdom is crumbling around him, a boy comes to him and asks to become a knight of the Round Table. It gives Arthur an idea. He knights the boy and then tells him, "Each evening from December to December, before you drift to sleep upon your cot, think back on all the tales that you remember of Camelot. Ask every person if they've heard the story, and tell them strong and clear if they have not, that once there was a fleeting wisp of glory called Camelot, where once it never rained till after sundown, By 8 a.m. the morning fog had flown. Don't let it be forgot that once there was a spot for one brief shining moment that was known as Camelot. Now run, boy, run. The legend of King Arthur has been so popular through the centuries because people have a deep desire to live in such a place of peace and tranquility. But such places have been exceedingly rare. Yet that's what Jesus calls us to create. Jesus was a king who cared for all people, who provided for all people, and he calls us to do likewise, to turn the other cheek, to give away the coat, to feed the hungry, to care for the homeless. He says, those who would be greatest among you, let them be your servant. He was a king that acted like a shepherd. Therefore, it's not surprising that our first reading this morning talked about shepherds. God was not pleased with shepherds who were not tending the sheep. So God would raise up shepherds who would tend and care for them. This was the shepherd and servant model of kingship that Jesus followed. But Jesus added one other aspect to the secular model of protection and provision of Beowulf and King Arthur, and that aspect was love. For Jesus, love was the greatest commandment, loving God and loving neighbor. Jesus said, by this will all people know that you are my disciples, that you love one another. Love then leads one to try to provide and protect. Jesus demonstrates this model as he begins his last week. He comes into Jerusalem riding not on a great war horse to demonstrate his power, but rather riding on a lowly donkey, demonstrating humility and his desire to be close to the people. He then demonstrates his desire to protect by overturning the tables of the money changers in the temple because they were fleecing the people. But this model of kingship, of love, protection, and provision runs counter to the model of the power of imperial and religious authorities. It's not surprising that they saw him as a threat and planned to get rid of him. But Jesus continued, even as they carried out their barbaric execution of living out his loving shepherd kingship, saying, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. He even forgave the penitent criminal on the cross next to him. It's not surprising, however, that the soldiers operating on the power model of kingship mocked him, saying he didn't have the power to save himself. So they put up a mocking sign over him. This is the King of the Jews. The Jewish community was totally disrupted by the empire as the empire continued operating on the power model of kingship. But when the Emperor Constantine declared the church the religion of the empire, as Judith mentioned last week, the church faced a decision regarding which model of kingship to follow: the power model of the empire or the shepherd model of love, protection, and provision. In the first century, the church, for the most part, had followed the shepherd model of Jesus, although they were gradually excluding women from leadership positions. But by the second century, Ignatius, Bishop of Antioch, was showing signs of moving toward the power and authority model, saying, "Do nothing without the bishop. You must follow the bishop as Jesus followed the Father." In the following centuries, as the church moved more and more toward the power and authority model, the question came to be, which bishop has the most power? Then around the year 450, Leo I, Bishop of Rome, made the following argument. Jesus' statement in Matthew 16, giving Peter the keys of the kingdom, shows that he bestowed supreme power and authority upon Peter. Peter was the first bishop of Rome. The power and authority of Peter is perpetuated in his successors. Therefore, the supreme power and authority of the Bishop of Rome. That settled it for the church in the West. But in the East, the church still looked to the head of the church in Constantinople for power and authority. Finally, about 500 years later, the head of the church in Rome and the head of the church in Constantinople excommunicated each other. Each was determined to have supreme power and authority. Even in the church, the imperial model of power and authority had won. Although the bishops carried the shepherd's crook, with few exceptions, lost was the shepherd model of love, protection, and provision. Everyone in the church was subject to the power and authority of the bishop who ruled in apostolic succession. After another 500 years, the church split again. This time it was, of course, the Protestant Reformation. Some did away with bishops, but none did away with struggles over power and authority. At least Thomas Cranmer tried to change the focus toward common worship with his Book of Common Prayer, but then we know what Bloody Mary had done to him. But Elizabeth I, who followed Mary, restored Cranmer's prayer book in 1559, which became the basis of our prayer book today. But the power model did not change. We're now 500 years after the Reformation, and through most of that time, many have continued the struggle for power and authority. Only in the last few decades have there been signs of some in the church trying to get back to the shepherd model of leadership. I'm glad that one of those trying to do so is the Episcopal Church in the U.S. That's a large part of the reason why I'm now an Episcopalian. Not only are they trying to follow Jesus' model in leadership, but also by inclusion of everyone, not only in the church, but also in the leadership itself. It still has bishops, of course, but they too are diverse and inclusive, and many of them see the shepherd's crook they carry as representative of a shepherd model of leadership, symbolizing love, protection, and provision, not as a symbol of power. Today, as we celebrate the Sunday of Christ the King and look forward to Thanksgiving this coming week, let us be thankful that Jesus called for a shepherd model of kingship based on love, protection, and provision, not one based on power and authority. And let us continue to try not only to build our church, but also to live our lives based on this model set forth by Christ our King. Amen.